Hi TYT, hi Facebook, hi YouTube, hi Twitter, hi everybody. It's me, Josh Gibbs, Josh.0 here for TYT Sports, and we're taking a little bit of a different avenue here for this YouTube video over our long 4th of July weekend. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who joins me on Tuesday nights at 10:05 p.m. Eastern Time for 10:05 Live, where we talk about Raw, SmackDown, we talk about pay-per-views, we talk about anything wrestling related. I really appreciate you guys joining me live for the 20 minutes or so that we're there. It's generated some really great discussions, and I sincerely appreciate it. So today what we're going to talk about is, what is the legacy of Chris Benoit? I thought that this question was going to be really interesting. I brought it up to the producers of TYT Sports. They said, let's run with it. And I really hope that this generates some discussion, because honestly, I don't think there's a wrong answer. And I'm really interested to see what people's take is on this. So what I want to do is just go over some facts, some 100% facts. We'll do that first about what happened. And then afterwards, we'll kind of dive into, I'll give my opinions and I'll give some examples, and we'll go from there. Okay, so it just happened roughly about 10 years ago. June 25th, 2007 was when the police entered his home and discovered the body of Benoit, his wife, and his son. And it quickly became clear that Benoit had murdered them, and then he had committed suicide subsequent to that. The only reason the police had entered his home was that friends and family became concerned. They hadn't heard from him for a couple of days. The only thing were some cryptic text messages that included just his address. Chavo Guerrero had a kind of a weird conversation. It wasn't anything overt like, I'm going to hurt myself and I need help. It was just, hey, I love you, and he was being just a little bit off. I mean, when you know someone for as long as the Guerreros did, then you just know when something's not right. So police entered his home and discovered this scene. The toxicology report on Benoit said he had traces of Xanax, hydrocodone, and elevated levels of testosterone. Now, some people took that to mean, well, then he was on steroids and roid rage was the explanation. But that's not true. In fact, the toxicology report and subsequent police reports went out of their way to say that this was not evidence of steroid abuse, and no steroids were present in his system, and so roid rage is not a plausible explanation. Steroids were found in his home after his death, but they were not in his body. His brain was analyzed, and they discovered that it was so damaged from CTE that it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. And CTE is one of the biggest issues we have in sports, not just in pro wrestling, but in professional football, even baseball, hockey, any sport where you have the potential for trauma to the head. CTE is becoming a much talked about issue, especially in the NFL. Science Daily published an article that really went into detail about just how damaged his brain was. And some of the symptoms of CTE include memory loss, depression, aggression, all of these things that other wrestlers have actually experienced during their career who are still around. People like Tommy Dreamer and Mick Foley have spoken openly about the effects of CTE that they have personally felt. Dizziness, memory loss, just things that are very uncharacteristic of themselves. And they consider themselves very fortunate. So even people like Chris Jericho went on his podcast and said, hey, I think concussions directly contributed to what happened to Benoit. That night, it was a Monday night. It was a Monday when Benoit's body was discovered. So what happened is Raw canceled the show for that evening, and instead they did a 3-hour tribute show about Chris. And so, I mean, everybody was devastated. It's a very emotional program that you can find on YouTube, and it's really interesting to watch, knowing what we know now, because after that show aired, slowly but surely the facts started to come out about what had actually taken place. And then you started to see this whitewashing of his legacy from the WWE. And it goes so deep, in fact, that you go on WWE.com and type in Benoit, no results come up. Nothing with him personally comes up. It's extremely difficult to find anything. No merchandise sales, nothing officially tied to the WWE. You can still get some videos and DVDs and stuff through aftermarket sellers, but nothing through them directly. That's how much they want to disassociate themselves with Benoit. Kurt Angle is one of the few people who still openly talks about him, saying that he's one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. And it's interesting to see someone like Kurt Angle, who has such a prominent role in the WWE now. He's not afraid to go out and talk about it. So here we are 10 years later. We know what happened. We know that he was directly responsible for the murders of his wife and son, and then he took his own life. So what is his legacy? How do we view him now, knowing those two things, these two incontrovertible facts that he did commit these horrible, horrible crimes before he took his own life, and he was also one of the greatest wrestlers who ever lived. At least top five, has to be. And there are plenty of people who will say that now. And, friends, Dave Meltzer, a very, very well respected and very seasoned wrestling correspondent, calls him one of the top 10, maybe even the top 5 all-time greats. A lot of friends say that Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005 kind of changed him, and that really made him take a turn for the worse. So how that played into it, unfortunately, we're not going to know. But how do we balance these two things? How do we balance knowing what a great competitor, performer, athlete he was versus what he did? And I think we can. I think you can look at what he did in his professional career and acknowledge that he was one of the greatest of all time, one of the greatest who ever lived. And you can also say he's also guilty of an absolutely horrific crime. And that doesn't mean we excuse it. That doesn't mean we in any way try to absolve him of any kind of guilt. I think these two things can coexist. And the example I use that's very recent is somebody like Aaron Hernandez. A counter argument could say, okay, well then if you want to look at Chris Benoit favorably, what about Aaron Hernandez? And my argument would be, well, Chris Benoit didn't have a history of crime. In fact, one of the few things on his record back in November to Remember in 1994, he accidentally broke Sabu's neck, and he felt so bad about it. He went to the locker room, broke down crying, and just was so shaken up over the fact that he hurt another performer, another professional colleague, that took him a long time to get over. And so that's the kind of thing that if somebody without remorse, somebody who had a history of violence wouldn't do. As far as any legal trouble, none that I could find in my research. His second wife, Nancy, who he ultimately killed, unfortunately, she had filed for divorce in 2003 after a few years of marriage, claiming that he would break some furniture, but eventually she dropped the suit and their marriage continued. So he was never charged with domestic violence. He was never charged with anything else that I could find. So there was no history of violence here. Now, we compare that to somebody like Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez had trouble that goes back even before his college days. For those of you who don't know, obviously Aaron Hernandez was a professional football player. He was a star in college, and then he got into a lot of serious legal trouble, was found guilty of murder, and ultimately committed suicide in prison. And so his legal trouble goes back to 2007 when he was 17 years old. Got into a bar fight. There was a double shooting. The bar fight was settled out of court. The double shooting, no charges were ever filed. A few years later, in 2012, there was a Boston double murder he was tied to. He was acquitted of murder but found guilty of illegal possession of a firearm. The next year, there was a shooting in Miami, and ultimately where the man who he was found guilty of murder was when that took place in 2013. The first one was settled out of court. The second one, he was found guilty of murder in the first degree, along with 5 firearms charges. Now, this charge was technically vacated in May of 2017 because of his death by suicide. It's currently being appealed. So is he technically an innocent man? I mean, that's not really, you can argue that back and forth. Legally speaking, is he considered innocent as far as that goes? Yes, but he was still found guilty of these murders. So who knows if his appeal would have been successful. But UF, the University of Florida, where he went to college, and along with the New England Patriots, did a very similar whitewashing to what the WWE did with Benoit. UF removed his name and likeness from everywhere on campus. The NFL had a photo of him in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and they removed that. All his endorsements obviously were canceled. The Patriots Pro Shop either removed or destroyed every bit of merchandise that had his name tied to it. Now, his brain was also released to Boston University to study CTE, to see if that may have played a role in it, but I don't think we're going to get the same association. The point that I'm trying to make is that Aaron Hernandez had a long history of violence. He had a long history of just being that kind of person. Benoit didn't. So I can much more easily look at what happened with Benoit and say, yeah, it was horrific, but I don't want to make it seem as if I'm just kind of being flippant about it, but I could say, yeah, this was an isolated incident. It was just the perfect storm of who knows what, a combination of his head trauma and depression and everything else, and then it all just came to a head and something happened. We're not going to know exactly what he was thinking about in those few days that transpired, over the few days when the crimes took place and ultimately his suicide. We just don't know. Whereas Aaron Hernandez, this was years and years of him committing crime, getting away with it, and then or just them kind of getting written off, where he ultimately goes free and gets to play professional football. So I'm much more comfortable saying Aaron Hernandez was that kind of person. And it's still a tragedy that he took his own life, but at the same time, he also did some unforgivable things as well. So I'm not willing to say, well, Aaron Hernandez, it's fine, let's just write it off. And he suffered from CTE, so he was a troubled youth. He was certainly troubled, but he still has this history of violence that Benoit didn't. I think you can look at other athletes whose careers ended with criminal mischief, with criminal wrongdoing. People like O.J. Simpson, Ray Caruth, Bruno Souza, all of these professional athletes ended their careers with just absolutely horrific crimes. And some paid for it and some didn't. So what is Benoit's legacy? How do we look at him? Do you look at him favorably, or do you think, no, it's just not the same? I look at Benoit and I say, look, I don't see the reason why we can't still say he was the greatest of all time. And yes, he committed a horrible, horrible crime. I mean, it really is unforgivable. Murdering your wife and your son, I mean, you have to be in a very, very unusual mental state to commit that sort of crime. And then right after that, I think it was 2 days later, they based on with the forensic evidence and things, then 2 days later he took his own life. So who knows what he was thinking about, what his mental state was during that period, but it's very clear that something was wrong with him, that something snapped. And based on the evidence we saw from his brain, from the autopsy, there was something really wrong with him. And CTE is still such a relatively new disease, we really don't know how it affects everybody because it affects athletes differently. We can see professional football players already trying to say, hey, if I would have known this was going to be the result, I would have never played the sport. That's not a small thing. That's a major deal. And the NFL certainly does not acknowledge, just like WWE, they don't acknowledge that CTE plays any part in this or that their sport is complicit in these kinds of injuries, because of course that would open them up to a whole host of lawsuits, and it would just be a legal nightmare for them financially and in the public relations department. But getting back on track with Benoit, I think that we can look at his legacy favorably, and we should. He was one of the greatest wrestlers who ever lived. Just look at some of his accolades. Held 22 belts in his lengthy career. He was in WWE, WCW, New Japan World Wrestling, ECW. He was world champion twice in WCW and WWE. He was scheduled to win it a third time, actually, the night of his death on that Raw. He was going to win it. He's one of only 5 men to be a Triple Crown champion in WCW and WWE. Only the second guy in history to win the Royal Rumble after starting as the #1 entrant. Shawn Michaels is the other one. So his accolades are not a small thing. He has a really, really impressive career. It just had a really bad ending and a really dark ending that is completely of his own doing. But there has to be something else. You can't just say, well, he was a murderer and a bad person, because the evidence just points to something else that kind of that wormed his way in there. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Hopefully this wasn't a downer kind of video for 4th of July, but I want to generate some discussion. I want to hear what you think. Please put it in the comments below. Let us know what side of this do you take. Can we still look at Chris Benoit favorably? Can we look at him as a champion, as a fantastic individual to the friends and family who knew him, who just had a very tragic ending and very unexpected ending? Or is his legacy tainted forever because of his crime? Is there no coming back from what he did? Are his crimes so horrific that's it? That's how he should be known, and that's how he should be remembered. The WWE has chosen their way, and I've chosen mine. Now I want to hear what you guys think. So please put your comments below. You can also hit me up on Twitter. You can hit me up on the TYT Sports Facebook page. I wrote an article about this that detail all of these things for Daily DDT, and I'll include a link of that here in the section in the description of this video. So if you want to take a few minutes to go and read that article, I would really appreciate it. And then let me know what you think in the comments of this video or in the comments of the article. I'll be here. As always, I'm Josh Benoit. I'll see you on Tuesday nights for 10:05 live at 10:05 p.m. Eastern Time. See you again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.